So, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for I Seek a Kind Person as part of our Stories Survive series. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you will visit the museum in person to see our current and upcoming exhibitions, including Art of Freedom, the life and work of Arthur Szyk, opening December 7th, 2025. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Now today, we are honored to be joined by Julian Borger. Julian Borger is the Guardian's senior international correspondent based in London. He covered the Balkan Wars in the 1990s and served as the Guardian's Middle East correspondent in Jerusalem and in Washington as bureau chief and then global affairs editor. He was part of the Guardian team that won the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service Journalism for its coverage of the Snowden files on mass surveillance. He also won the 2016 One World Media Press Award for Syria's truth smugglers about the investigation of the war crimes of the Assad regime. Borger has written 2 books, The Butcher's Trial, 2016, about the manhunt for Balkan war crimes, and I Seek a Kind Person, 2024, about Jewish children saved from the Nazis with the help of newspaper adverts. Thank you again for joining us. Now I'm going to hand things over to Julian.
Hello from London. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's an honor for me to be here. And thank you for giving up a bit of your afternoon or evening to hear a bit about my book, I Seek a Kind Person, which is really, it's a work of journalism, although part of that journalism is directed back upon my own family, so it's part journalism, part memoir, and the idea of it, or the germ for it, came in late 2020, the last weeks of the first Trump administration, in which he was deporting a lot of West Africans, particularly Cameroonians, back to a country in which they were potentially at risk. And I was talking to one of the lawyers that was trying to protect them from being deported. And at one point, out of the blue, she started talking about in our email exchanges how we hand on trauma from one generation to another, and started talking about her father, who came out of Vienna in the late 1930s, and his escape had something to do with the Manchester Guardian, which is the forerunner of my newspaper, The Guardian. It was originally in Manchester. And this triggered in me a memory that there was a piece of family law that the Manchester Guardian had something to do with my own father coming out of Vienna in 1938. But really, to my shame, it's something that I had not until then really thought about much or tried to investigate, in part because the family member who passed that on had sort of questionable credibility for their love of embellishment and good stories. Anyway, that is in a way, my excuse for not having looked into this earlier. But talking to this lawyer, a lovely woman called Ruth Hargrove, I decided to get in touch with the newspaper archivist because the newspaper, the Guardian, was coming up to its 200th birthday, and I thought this role, if the Guardian did play a role in helping Jews get out of Central Europe, in particular Vienna, that's something worth looking back on, an interesting episode. Although, I had no evidence or anything really to back it up. And a couple of days went by, and I was in the car park, the parking lot of a Whole Foods in Northern Virginia, and I got this email from this archivist with an attachment, a photo attachment, and said, "Is this what you're looking for?" And if Isabel could put up that slide, this is what I received in this attachment, which really took my breath away. It is a list of 6 adverts in the sort of small ads column from the Manchester Guardian, August the 3rd, 1938. And clearly, the second one down was about my father, because I happen to know what the family address was, Hinterstrasse in Vienna. And it really, still has the sort of power to give me a bit of a shock every time I see it. I seek a kind person who will educate my intelligent boy, aged 11, Viennese of good family, Borger, 512, Hinterstrasse, Vienna 3. It's the second one down. And instantly, 2 things became clear from that. One was the state of desperation that his parents, my grandparents, would have been in to advertise my father like that. The second thing is he was obviously not alone. Here in one day's newspaper, I think one of these is not someone from Vienna looking for foster, but the other 4 are children looking with their parents, looking for someone basically to save them from Nazi Vienna. And we're going through. Eventually, I went through all the Manchester Guardians, 38 and 39, and they're all together about 80 children that this applied to. The 80 children that were advertised in the small ads in the Manchester Guardian from Vienna under Nazi rule. And so the book is about what happened to these 80 children. I mean, that's the work of journalism, in that I could not go and investigate what happened to them. The adverts raised the question of what became of all these children. Did they survive? Where did they end up? But it also ended up as an inquiry into my own family history. And we grew up in West London with in a way that I've come to realize is the same as many Jews in the West who are descended from refugees or the survivors of the Holocaust, that we knew basic facts, but we were sheltered from the details, and we were sheltered from the kind of emotional weight of those details. We knew the basic facts about my father, that he had come out, that advert had succeeded in finding foster parents in Wales, a couple of school teachers who lived in Carnarvon in Wales, and that he had been raised by these foster parents, although eventually his own parents had been able to escape. But because they were working they had restrictions on their visas. My grandmother worked as a domestic worker, a maid. My father worked first as an agricultural. Grandfather worked as an agricultural laborer, and then working in a factory. They weren't able to look up after him, so he grew up in Wales with the foster parents. but we had no real sense of really what had happened, the details of what had happened, and what the mark had been, the mark that was left on my grandparents and my father. My father had taken his own life, took his own life in 1983. And so this is some almost 40 years earlier, before I was sent these adverts. And when he died, it was my job to call around friends and family and tell them, you know, the terrible news. And the last call I made was to his foster mother, the woman, the survivor of this couple, who had brought him up in Wales, in Carnarvon, whose name was Nance Bingley. And her immediate reaction on hearing the news was that my father, Robert, was the Nazis' last victim, and that they'd got to him in the end, which made no sense to me whatsoever. He had, in his note that he had left for us children, he hadn't mentioned any of that background at all. He talked about personal and professional disappointment, but she was absolutely adamant. Because I didn't know what to do with that fact, I sort of shelved it and went on with my life. And you know, decades passed before this came up quite by chance, and this advert was sent to me, which began a process, a search from on my point of view, looking at what the circumstances of his childhood were, what happened to him, what happened to the family, and what these mementos that I had been left. I had kind of traveled around the world as a foreign correspondent with this little box of keepsakes, including the passports of my grandparents, was the big red J stamped in them, and the swastika on the front. My grandfather's membership card of the Social Democratic Party, and the medal that he'd won fighting for the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the First World War. I kind of carried these around without really knowing their significance and how they fitted into the story of my family's story. They were sort of dots that I hadn't managed to and I hadn't really attempted to put together. So in the process of doing the research for the book, I found an awful lot more of what had happened to my family, and in really unexpected places, because my father had stopped talking about anything to do with the Holocaust, what happened in Nazi Austria. None of the people who'd known him after he'd reached adulthood knew anything about it. But there was a memoir published in Welsh that my family had been completely oblivious to, written by someone who'd known him at school when he was just freshly arrived, and talking about what had happened. That my grandfather had been made, like many Jews in Vienna, who'd been arrested and then made to scrub the pavements with little brushes, while neighbors spat on them and jeered at them. The family had to hide out in a cellar for 5 days. They had ransacked my father's grandmother's apartment, throwing her very prized piano out onto the street. And I think, you know, the biggest discovery from my point of view in the family research involved in the writing of this book is that we had been we'd grown up thinking that our family had somehow emerged from the Holocaust, from a Nazi takeover Austria, completely unscathed, that everyone had survived. Wasn't true at all. What had happened is that the family had stopped talking about the people who had perished, who'd been killed, who'd been murdered. My grandmother's sister and father, my step grandmother's husband, my great aunt's son, who had been tortured to death by the Gestapo. His name was Mordecai Motty. And it turned out, through looking through the files in Vienna, but also the files of the French resistance, that he'd been a hero of the French resistance in a section called the Travail Allemand, the German work section, which were German speakers who were used to go undercover, sent back across the lines from Vichy France into Austria in this case. And Motty was one of these undercover agents sent to the Hermann Goering's steelworks in Linz, and due to a series of errors by his network back in Paris, had been discovered, arrested by the Gestapo, and tortured to death. The whole story of this terrible failure and the price that he paid, and the price that my great aunt, who was also part of this same network, had paid by losing her son towards the end of the war, we knew nothing about. For me, it was the most important discovery from doing this work. And what the extraordinary thing was, although he was my father's cousin, because my father was no only child, they'd grown up almost as brothers. All the pictures from that era of the 30s show them together as thick as thieves, on a tricycle together with their grandfather together. And so it really struck me the degree of alienation, separation my father had created from this past, because was his someone that was as close almost as a brother, who'd been tortured to death, and yet we did not talk about him. We didn't have his picture on the wall. He wasn't part of the family history. And one of the blessings of having the opportunity to do this book was to be able to go to Vienna as a family and put stones on his grave marker, and really make good on, finally, belatedly, on the promise that was on that gravestone, unvergessen, unforgotten. He had been forgotten, but by this string of chance encounters, I was able to dig up that history again. Most of the book, however, is about my father's contemporaries, who were among these other 80 children who were saved by these newspaper adverts, or with the help of these newspaper adverts, helped to get out of Nazi Vienna. And the reason is because you needed some kind of sponsorship in order to get into Britain and get out of Vienna, to get an exit permit and all the papers necessary to leave. And I mean, the stories of some of these children were so amazing that the real motive to write the book was to tell these extraordinary stories, and the byproduct was to, I saw it at the time as sort of the price I had to pay was to delve into my own family's history, but it turned out there was far more to find out than I could ever imagined. But when it came to the other children, really the stroke of luck that underpins this book and made this book, from my point of view, worth writing, was that among the 80 children who I was pretty much able in each case to track down what had happened to them using some of these websites, like you may well be familiar with jewishgen.org, Ancestry, and so on, and the British versions of that, Find My Past, able to eventually track them down and find out what happened to them. Most of them had survived, and most of them had ended up in the US. because if you were in Britain in 1940, the only way to go was when Britain looked very vulnerable. Most of the refugees in Britain at the time, Jewish refugees at the time, my family was among the exceptions. Most got on the ships out of Liverpool bound for New York. And so a lot of the stories ended up in the US. But among these 80 stories, only a handful, or slightly bigger than a handful, some half dozen of these children out of the adverts had written full accounts or had given full accounts of what had happened to them in Austria and what had happened to them afterwards. And the stroke of luck was that in this half dozen accounts, either written down as memoirs for internal consumption for the family, or published in Dutch, or given in long interviews for a documentary that had long since been forgotten. Among those six, there were such different stories, very different stories, all of them about survival, but the survival in so many very different ways. And I'll talk very briefly about three of the cases, which gives some idea of the very different experiences that these children had on their way out of Vienna and what happened to after them. One was the first person I found, who was easy to find, was a man called George Mandler. And he was easily to find because he'd become quite well known as a psychologist. Like my father, he would also become a psychologist, and he was well known. And when I looked into his details, he'd already died. But when I looked into his biography, it was clear that this is the same man. And what was amazing about him was that he was so like my father in terms of the facts of his life. He came from the same district, a few blocks away from my father, where my father grown up. He'd gone to Britain, gone to British school, ended up as a psychologist. In fact, me and George Mandler's son, who's now a historian at Cambridge, found out that they had been at the same small seminar, leaving us to wonder whether they'd ever discuss their shared history. But what was different about George Mandler was where my father was silent and non-communicative about the past. George Mandler was inquisitive, introspective, and very frank about what happened. And so for me, it kind of filled in a lot of the missing space that surrounded my father, the sort of mystery that surrounded my father's childhood, in terms of what a childhood in 1930s Vienna was like, and what it was like when the Nazis moved in the Anschluss in March 1938. But what was really striking about George Mandler's story is he had gone to the UK and then got on one of these ships to New York, and he was old enough before the end of the war to join up with the US Army, and he became what became known as the Ritchie Boys, who were refugees from Central Europe, from the Reich, who spoke German, and they became trained up as intelligence officers and sent back with the US Army. And George Mandler became one of these Ritchie Boys. Another of them was Henry Kissinger. And they had kind of free reign by the end, as the war was ending, to drive around from unit to unit, helping cross-examine captured German officers. And towards the end of the war, he was sent out with his other Ritchie Boys to look for the remains of the SS. There was this fear at the time, the end of the war, the SS would make this, constitute this stay-behind force that would attack the occupying powers, the Allied powers, and they were going to be called the Werwolf, the werewolves, and so a lot of resources were put into trying to track them down. And George Mandler and his colleagues came across a hut in the middle of the German forest where it was clear that a unit of these SS sort of stay behind troops had been using as a hideout, and had recently fled, and they came across this hut in the middle of the woods, and as the platoon rather, that they were accompanying moved on, they found this big chest under the floorboards in this hut full of Reichsmarks, which was still currency then, and so they kind of found this Nazi treasure, and it became a kind of a sort of self-restitution. The three of them shared it and became their sort of starting up money on return to the US. Another of the children who came out about the same time as my father through these adverts was a girl called Gertrude Langer, who was found a family willing to look after her. So the family managed to get her out, but then as time went on and the door closed in terms of the possibilities of getting out of Vienna, her parents and younger siblings found the last resort was to go to Shanghai, because Shanghai, it didn't require a visa for Jews leaving Vienna, but although the Nazis required paperwork from the Chinese authorities, and there happened to be a consular officer there in Vienna who was prepared to write out any visas to anyone who asked. And so that became a kind of last resort to many Viennese Jews. And so the parents, Gertrude Langer's parents, ended up in Shanghai, and they had to arrange for Gertrude to join them. And so she got on this ship. It was actually a Japanese ship, because it was before Japan had joined the war, and she made her way to Shanghai, this extraordinary journey that she describes in a documentary, a very long documentary about Shanghai in that era, which was a sort of, when they arrived, it was almost like they called it Vienna on the Hangpu. It was a city that had been largely built in terms of its grand buildings by two Jewish families, Iraqi Jewish families who'd come, who traveled with the British and with the Opium Wars and the opium trade that the British had encouraged. The Sassoons and the Kadoris had built these huge hotels. It was very like Central Europe. There were cafes, there were dressmakers, and that's where Gertrude found a job on arrival. Because all this seemed to be, a lucky chance of a sort of coming across this haven, but of course it all came crumbling down in December 1941. Same day as Pearl Harbor, the Japanese moved into the international settlement in Shanghai and took over, and they put Shanghai's Jews into a ghetto. They didn't really know. They had mixed feelings about the Jews. The Japanese didn't have strong anti-Semitic feelings, but they had sort of internalized this idea that the Jews were really in control, and to some extent in Shanghai they were. The SS came to Shanghai and tried to persuade them that the way to solve their Jewish problem was to get rid of them. And one way they suggested was to put them all on a big ship, send them out into the ocean and torpedo the ship. That was a step too far as the Japanese were concerned, and they kept them in the Shanghai ghetto, which for me was a really unknown chapter in the story of the Jewish experience and of the Holocaust. But Gertrude and her husband who she met there describe in great detail what it was like to live through the Shanghai ghetto, how people survived, how people kept their faith going, and in the end, about 80% of them lived through the experience. A third case study that I should talk about, another of the children from the adverts, was a boy called Manfred Schwarz, who didn't get as far as Britain, although they'd advertised in the Manchester Guardian, the family at the last moment decided that he should join his brother Fritz Schwarz, who'd made his way to the Netherlands. And when the Holland fell in 1940, they were still there. They hadn't been able to cross the Channel, and by the time the Nazis arrived, it was too late. Fred Schwarz, in an extraordinary memoir that was published some time ago in Dutch, describes in detail their odyssey from their first arrest, being put into Westerbork. They were sent to Theresienstadt. They survived Theresienstadt. They were sent to Auschwitz. By some fluke, they also survived Auschwitz, ended up in a labor camp that was a satellite of Buchenwald. And then in the very end of the war, the two brothers found themselves in this shrinking area of land between the advancing Red Army and the US forces arriving from the West. And everyone, the inmates, their former guards, German civilians, were scrambling to go west to escape the Red Army and to get to American soil. And in this memoir, Fred Schwarz described these moments, these incredible moments of panic, chaos, where survival was a matter of sheer luck. And it's one of the most extraordinary accounts of survival taken as a whole, ever read. And had been there in Dutch all this time. It was called Trains on a Dead Track. And because he was one of the children in the Manchester Guardian adverts, it gave me the opportunity to retell his story to a English-speaking audience, which was, I found, breathtaking. So I just found, as a journalist, these stories had to be told. There's really amazing stories of survival through fluke and luck. But for me personally, they especially with George Mandler, but with the others, they filled this dark space that had surrounded the story of our family because of this silence that had enveloped the past, enveloped the Vienna years in my family. And obviously, my father had found a kind person. Well, he found two kind people that were my grandfather had been calling for in his advert when he wrote, "I seek a kind person." The Bingleys family in Wales have really, the more I knew about them, I knew about them growing up, and the more I found, to the extent that they had sacrificed and they had gone out on a limb to make sure that my father was able to make the journey to Britain, it for me set a sort of benchmark to aspire to in terms of how to engage in a hostile, cruel world, which the 30s were, and which the world in which we are living now increasingly resembles. Others of the children were not so lucky. It isn't an entirely black and white story. Some of the children who came across were given a terrible time when they arrived in Britain. One case, a girl called Gertrude Batcher arrived in this middle-class family in the Shires, in the English countryside, where her would-be foster mother felt that she'd done enough just by saving Gertrude. And for the rest of the time during the whole war, thought she had the right to exploit her. And so she was used almost as slave labor in the household, getting up at the crack of dawn to do the cleaning. The worst thing, though, was this host family did not help Gertrude save her parents, because the first obligation, the first necessity facing the children who arrived through these ads and found foster parents was to try and save their actual parents by trying to make connections in Britain with people who would sponsor their parents, giving them a job as maid or as a valet or as a chauffeur, and get the paperwork done. It was an unbearable burden on these children of 13, 14, 15 years old. And Gertrude Batcher's host family didn't lift a finger to help. They were called the Partingtons. And she describes in a memoir that she wrote under great pressure just for her family's consumption, but they shared it with me. It was called Because You Wanted to Know, a reference to the pressure that her own family was putting on her to share this story. This family who had brought her into Britain did not help her get her parents out. Her parents, like many other parents of the children from these ads, died, were killed in their case in Belarus. And Gertrude, like many of the children in the book from the newspaper ads, had to live with this burden the rest of their lives, that they had survived. They had theoretically the opportunity to save their parents, and they had failed. It was an enormous burden that they had to live with the rest of their life. But overall, when I kind of came to the end of the book and looked, what I wrote it because of the stories really I found compelling. The stories told of the adventures, the lives that these children had lived, and the way that they had got out, I found compelling. At the end of it, it seemed to me that there were some clear themes, and the central theme that came out of it for me was, although the violence of war, the violence of atrocities and war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide have reverberations that last for generations, so do individual acts of kindness, like those of the Bingley family in Wales. Myself, my siblings, and our children, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the Bingleys. And so these acts of kindness have the same kind of reverberation effect of trauma, but work, if you like, in the opposite direction. And what really struck me was that in a world like in the 30s, which bears similarities to what we see going, the direction the world is taking today, these acts of kindness themselves emerge as acts not only of personal sacrifice and generosity, but acts of subversion and resistance. I think there's about 20 minutes left. If you have any questions at all, please send them, and I will try my best to respond.
Well, thank you, Julian, so much for that wonderful presentation. We do have some questions from the audience already, which I will ask, but also we do still have 20 minutes. So if anyone is inspired, while we're talking about the questions, feel free to continue submitting questions. I'll also combine some questions that are similar just for the sake of time. Um, but first, we have a couple questions in general just about the reaction to your book. We have someone who's asking how your family has reacted to the book, and also someone who is asking how your colleagues at The Guardian have reacted, and if any of them, before hearing about your book, were aware of the history of these newspaper advertisements.
Okay, start with my family.
Mhm,
I'm very lucky. My family was very supportive of it. They didn't know much at all, and I was sort of the historian of the family, so I was the one
mhm,
motivated to go out looking for this story. The greatest act of generosity really came from my mother, who lived
mhm,
through these events and who had to, although she is a British, she wasn't Jewish. She comes from Manchester itself, and had really, by the time she met my father, knew nothing about this. She knew he
mhm,
was a refugee, knew nothing about sort of trauma that he had gone through and that he was carrying. And uh, her reaction to me when I said, "Look, this will be painful stuff if to write about it. If I'm writing about
mhm,
these children, I have to write about our family. If I have to write about the family, I have to uh, talk about my father's suicide and what we know about it." And she said, "Well, it's true, isn't it?" And that was her attitude, that if it was true, write it down. The terrible thing was, this book was on Audible, and
mhm,
my mother, who has failing eyesight, listened to it on Audible, um, but she didn't know how to make the Audible reading of the book resume where she left off. So it kept on
oh,
again and again, taking her back to the beginning, which is what the part where my father takes my life. So it was quite traumatic uh, for her to go through that again. But they were very generous about it. They were obviously interested to know and glad to know the facts of where our family, the background of our family. In terms of the rest of my colleagues in the Guardian, no one knew about these adverts. Very, very few
mhm,
people in the world had sort of noticed them. Um, uh, they had been spotted here and there, but it was largely a story that was untold.
mhm. Thank you. Um, you kind of left off in the perfect place for our next question, which is one of our viewers remarks that this is the first time they've heard of these, newspaper advertisements and the story of these children, and they're correctly inferring that it's a relatively unknown story. And they want to know, why do you think that is, that this is sort of the first time it's been really thoroughly investigated?
I think the main reason is it was overtaken. At the time my grandparents put these adverts into the newspaper, uh, August 38. No one knew that there was going to be the kinder transport.
Hmm.
Kinder transport started going November, December 38. So at the time, it was the only way to get out. Um, and was sort of overtaken in terms of sheer scale, in terms of getting children out of Vienna and Prague, Berlin, by the kinder transport. 10,000 came out on transport. We're talking about 80 who got out through these adverts. And so I think probably the story got swamped by the story of the kinder transport.
Hmm. Makes sense. Well, thank you for sharing. We have another question um, that's sort of just about the logistics of how this all worked. Someone is wondering if you know if any of these foster families of, the 80 children received any sort of money or aid from the British government, or if it was just something, they did themselves.
No, none at all. The British government, although, to some extent claims credit for the kinder transport, it was really
Hmm.
pushed on them by the Jewish community in the UK and the Quakers. Uh,
Hmm.
the British government did it through gritted teeth, really. And there had to be guarantees of of employment or of study, and that living expenses would be covered and all this. So no,
Mhm.
it was not a great act of generosity by the British government.
Thank you. We also have some questions about your personal experience writing this book. Several viewers have noticed you're a journalist by trade, and someone is wondering how you think that your journalistic experience impacted your approach to this book, and also if the process of writing the book differed significantly from the process of, your other journalism.
I think well, I approached the other family stories as a journalist.
Hmm.
Journalist is a specific type of journalism where all the protagonists and the victims are all dead, except for one. And I'm sorry, this is something I've meant to say in the outset. There was one. I was delighted that there was one of these children still alive. I'd given up hope at the very end
Oh.
when I was kind of doing a double check. I found this woman who called Liz Ruderman, born Lisbeth Weiss, who I talked to in Zoom, and one of the most the one of the most the best experiences coming out of writing this was the ability to make this link back living link back to my father's childhood, and to talk to someone who'd gone through the same experiences. So that was a kind of key event. And so that was the one exception. I was able to talk to a living witness. The rest
Mhm.
was going to the archives and working in archives, which I found something I really enjoyed
Mhm.
because it was fruitful. The Austrians have historically been very good at keeping archives, keeping details and records and so on, and so it was possible to dig down through them. Of course, what was different is when I turned sort of my journalist instincts to my own family, it's not quite the same. And I found
Mhm.
it as a journalist, all my instincts was not to use the first person singular or plural,
Mhm.
and I found that, and so writing it at a beginning, I felt like that was the price I had to be able to tell these other incredible stories,
Mhm.
was to say something about myself and to talk in the first person, which I found excruciating at first, but because that necessity of doing it led to all these discoveries about a family that I realized, and a father I realized I hardly knew in so many ways. It became enormously rewarding as well.
Well, thank you for sharing. We have one more question that's sort of more personal about your experience. Someone wrote in and asked if you have any advice for anyone watching who might have a similar story, or their families or parents, grandparents, or survivors. Do you have any advice for anyone who's looking to write about their family's Holocaust story, or even just dive more deeply into researching their own family history?
Well, yeah, I mean, my main piece of advice I came out with, in a way, it sort of comes too late for most of us, is to sort of interview your granny, interview your auntie before it's too late. The sense of regret I had for not delving deeper when my surviving relatives were still alive. I mean, I did interview them because I was a journalist, but I didn't interview them really enough, deeply enough. Now that is not necessarily, an option anymore. We've come to this tipping point where the last
Mhm.
survivors are going. And I was so lucky to find one of these children from the ad still alive. But we are reaching that tipping point when the last of the survivors are going. And so that is no longer an option. But I did find that, especially when it comes to Austrian Jews, Vienna Jews, there is a huge wealth of material there. If anyone wanted to, get hold of me and ask, advice about how to go about confronting that material and digging down into it, I'd be very happy to give advice, because I found it, with me, it was sort of trial and error at the beginning. And eventually, I found out, kind of how it works. But I was amazed at really the amount of material I was able to find. And so, I as someone who believes in history, to believe that we are affected by our history, our personal histories, our family histories, every minute, every day. I found it. I'm so grateful I was sort of had the excuse, the opportunity to write this, because it feels different knowing sort of the details of where you come from, and I really strongly recommend it. Uh, uh, to find every last bit of family history there is out there, and put it down so that it lasts, and so the stories of these people who came before us live on.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We have one other question that just came in. Someone is wondering if you have been in touch with any descendants of the Bingleys who fostered your father, or if you've been in touch with anyone else who was involved in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm close friends with the granddaughter, and not so long ago they organized a reburial of Nance and her husband Reg, um, so that they could sort of rest side by side. They died 40 years apart, almost 40 years, no, 30 years apart, and so everyone came together. And I've been going back to Carnarvon to when I was doing the research, and talking to people there who knew my father as a schoolboy and so on. But yes, I am particularly close with the granddaughter.
Well, thank you for sharing, and it's lovely to hear that you've been in touch with them as well. We're close to the hour, and I think we've got most of our questions, but we have one more sort of specific question. Early on in your presentation, you mentioned reading the work of a Welsh author who talked about this story. And we have someone who's wondering if you know how that author learned about the details of this story and what their process was like.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, they were. She was a schoolgirl at the same time my father was a schoolboy, and they became close friends. And it was at a time when my father had just arrived, and so um, and was so talking about this that it was very, and would break down crying as he told her these stories about what had happened to them. And so she knew him at a time before the door shut, before he decided he
Hmm.
was going to be English, had no history, that he was an English psychologist, and that was it. And so it was this sort of rare window into that past. And she had written it in a story of her own life, into which this was just a chapter. I happened to know this boy growing up when I was at school, and this was his story, and it had been out there, but in Welsh. And it was only when I started digging and went back to Carnarvon that someone said, "Oh yeah, he's mentioned in this Welsh memoir," and so we got the relevant part translated into English, and in it was more information about my family's history than the whole family, any of the family had known before.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think that appears to be our last question. So apologies if any slipped through the cracks, or if I missed any questions. But I just want to thank you, Julian, so much for coming on today and sharing your story and your family's story. Also, of course, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. And I'd like to remind everyone that you can purchase Julian's book, I Seek a Kind Person, at the link in the chat. I've just put those links back in the chat for you if you'd like to take a look. We also hope that if you enjoyed today's program, you'll consider making a donation to support the museum, which you can do at mjhnyc.org/support. We also hope that you will join us for our upcoming programs, which you can also find on our website at mjhnyc.org/current events. So a big thank you again to our audience for joining us, and for Julian to come on and share your story. Thank you so much, everyone, and we hope you have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.